so much, Gustav, and thank you so much for having me here today. I want to begin, as we often do in Australia when we're presenting, by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that I'm working on today. At the moment, that's Larrakia country, which is in the Northern Territory, but my hometown is in New South Wales, which is on, and I live in Sydney, which is on Gadigal land, and pay my respects to elders past and present. I think in Australia, when we're talking about over-incarceration and we're talking about imprisonment, it's really important to acknowledge country and I guess the history of colonisation in Australia and the sort of the very clear line between the experience for so many First Nations people in terms of invasion and then incarceration. So we'll unpack that a little bit as we go through. I have to say that we often in Australia look to Europe in terms of how we might do things better. So it's a little hard to hear, Gustav and others that I've spoken to, about some sort of, I guess, pushbacks or some of that kind of engagement in law and order politics in some places which we've often kind of aspired to. I'm going to talk today, I'm going to talk today about the work of the Justice Reform Initiative, which is a relatively new advocacy organisation in Australia. And I hope that the sort of work that we're doing is relevant to the work that's happening over in Europe and in Asia and other places where there are people on the line. I'm going to just share my screen. I've got a presentation. Apologies for my very messy desktop that you're going to see for a minute before I get this slideshow started. So firstly, just to introduce the work of the Justice Reform Initiative, we were actually started only a couple of years ago, but just as Gustav introduced, I've been working primarily in the community sector, especially in services working with people leaving prison. And a lot of the time when we're working in the community sector, the advocacy work or the reform work is sort of something that we do almost off to the side of our desk. It's not something that's front and center because we're very focused on working with clients. So it's been a real privilege to move into this role, which is national, which has a very ambitious vision, which is to reduce incarceration in Australia by 50% by 2030. And I'll talk as we go along about why I think that vision is realistic. The Justice Reform Initiative has 120 very eminent Australians as our patrons, including 2 former Governor-Generals, former members of Parliament from all sides of politics, a lot of very respected academics, respected Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leaders, former judges. We've also got many former corrections commissioners, police commissioners, and a whole lot of other community leaders that have really added their voices to this movement to reduce incarceration in Australia. And what we're seeking to do is to work with policymakers and with parliamentarians on all sides of politics, people of goodwill across the country, to really look at how we might turn things around and implement evidence-based justice policy in order to reduce crime, reduce incarceration, and ultimately build safer communities. We're funded through a philanthropic organisation called the Paul Ramsay Foundation. And I'll talk a little bit more about what we're doing as we go through, but just to sort of give you a sense of the Australian context, and again, it's obviously complex comparing places. One of the things that I think is really important in Australia when we're looking at over-incarceration is that over the last 2 decades, we've had this incredible increase in incarceration at the same time as crime rates have been absolutely stable, or in fact, in many of the major categories, actually decreasing. What we know is that there is absolutely no relationship between the increase in incarceration and the sort of stability of and what's happening in crime. So the increase in incarceration is a consequence of policy choices rather than a response to any increase in offending or any increase in the severity of offending. So we need to have that very clearly sort of on the table. The Productivity Commission in Australia put out a report last year which found, amongst other things, sort of costed what it is that we're spending on imprisonment, about $5.2 billion each year, which is just on the sort of operating costs and many more on new builds and capital works. but also compared Australia to the rest of the world in terms of this growth in incarceration, and found that between 2003 and 2018, there were only 2 countries in the world that had a greater growth in incarceration, and those 2 countries were Turkey and Colombia. So Australia is really out of step with a lot of countries, certainly in Western Europe, certainly Canada, New Zealand, we're seeing sort of some decreases in incarceration as well. So our ambition to reduce incarceration by 50% is really an ambition to get us into line with a lot of other countries that are not incarcerating at the rate that we are. There are plans for prison expansion in almost every state and territory at this time when crime rates are stable or in fact decreasing. And I suspect this might be similar to some other places for participants today. We've got a third or more than a third, about 37% of our prisoner population are not sentenced. So they're on remand, they haven't received a sentence or they haven't been found guilty. We've got a massive overrepresentation of First Nations people in our prisons. So more than 30% of the adult prisoner population are First Nations, compared to about 3.3% of the general population. And this is even higher in the children's population. More than 50% of the children that we imprison are First Nations children. And where I'm currently working, which is in the Northern Territory, it's close to 100% of children in custody are Aboriginal here. We also have an overrepresentation of people with mental health conditions. Around 60% of people in our prisons have mental health conditions, disabilities. The number for cognitive impairment ranges between 8 and 20%, depending on the sort of research you look at. And people from what is often called here postcodes of disadvantage. So those are sections of the community or geographic regions where there are high indicators of a whole range of different kinds of disadvantage. We know also 50% of people that leave prison are homeless on release. And just in terms of the sort of failure, I guess, of incarceration to do the things that often the community expect incarceration will, we know that 60% of people in prison in Australia today have been there before, and close to 50% of people released today will return within 2 years. And that number goes up the more times that somebody has been to prison. So again, I'm sure that what I'm saying here isn't probably very different. We know that around the world, people who are very disadvantaged often end up being managed in justice system settings rather than receiving the support and care and connection that people require in the community. So when we started this organisation, I should say it was started by a former minister in federal government, a man called Robert Tickner, who was the Minister for Aboriginal Affairs for a very long time. And he really, for the last 30 years has been trying to work to reduce incarceration, especially amongst First Nations people in Australia. And he started sort of looking at what it is that we could do differently or should do differently to try and turn the dial to change the conversation. So when we started thinking, we knew that there'd been lots of people doing advocacy work that were activists, that were working within corrections as well, that were really, very clear that what we were doing wasn't working. But we also knew that we hadn't been very successful in any of our advocacy work to date, given the increasing numbers. So we started looking at, well, what is the problem that we're trying to solve and how might we do it differently? When we looked at what the problem is, what we identified is that prison has become this default measure, as I said, that's used to address crime in the criminal justice system, but also this default system to manage really complex disadvantage. But of course, we know that prisons don't work to do either of those things. We also recognise that there is a systemic failure to address the underlying social determinants of contact with the justice system. We also know that politically here, being perceived to be tough on crime has become a very convenient, very politically accepted strategy in response to crime. We know that both sides of politics, we've got two sort of major parties here and a number of independents and Greens, but we know that both major parties have engaged in law and order politics, which is often sort of, I guess, exacerbated by the media's, the way that crime is reported and the way that the criminal justice system has reported, which is very sensationalized reporting of crime, which further sort of dehumanizes the people that go to prison and also perpetuates this idea that we need to be tough on crime to have a safe community. And then the final problem is that despite this extraordinary body of evidence, and I'll talk a little bit about that as we go through, despite this body of evidence about prisons' failure, about what works in terms of alternatives, we've got very limited commitment to, or in fact, awareness of what building genuine alternatives to prisons or pathways out of prisons on the part of policymakers and the general public. We've got very limited understanding or commitment to what that might look like. So in terms of our strategies for change, we are focusing on the political advocacy that's developing very strong relationships with parliamentarians on all sides of politics across Australia. And that's mostly at a state and territory level, which is the level that operates prisons. So that's a really interesting process, and perhaps we can chat about that in the conversation in terms of how that's going. We've had, I think, over the last year, about 118 sort of meetings with separate parliamentarians to try and bring people on board. We're also very focused on changing the public conversation and really trying to change the media narrative from one that reports sort of almost exclusively on this tough on law and order rhetoric to a story instead where prisons are in fact viewed as not the answer. They're not the place that's going to actually address the drivers of incarceration. We're trying to increase public awareness and support. So I do a lot of this kind of thing, talking to people, especially people outside of the justice system who often don't understand why it is that we are over-incarcerating or what it is that we might do differently, and working to connect stakeholders and advocates. And I guess what we're really trying to do especially is engage not just with all sides of politics, but also engage very closely with government and really recognising the expertise that exists within government agencies and certainly within law enforcement and within corrections in terms of what could or should be done differently. I apologise for my croaky throat. I'm sort of a week out of COVID and I've got a lingering sort of cough, which is very annoying for everybody that's listening, I'm sure. So in terms of how we translate this evidence into political appetite, what we're saying is, look, there are multiple examples, both in Australia and internationally, that show, that we can actually do things very differently in that there are programs that are led by the community, by health and disability sectors that can dramatically disrupt these sort of trajectories into the justice system. We know that there's evidence for the effectiveness of particular measures within the justice system. There's specialist courts that can divert people from prison. There's pre-charge police diversion. There's many forms of diversion that we know has a strong evidence base. We know we can shift legislative frameworks in terms of reducing reoffending. There are lots of diversionary programs. There's post-release supports. There's evidence about what works while people are in prison. So we have, in Australia, we've got 3 decades worth of government reports and inquiries and commissions into this issue of the overrepresentation of disadvantaged groups, including significantly Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander populations, and into the failures of imprisonment for these groups. And I should have said from the outset, we're not an abolitionist organisation. We're absolutely saying there is a role for imprisonment, but we are saying that the overuse of incarceration is in fact the issue that we really need to respond to, and the failure of our existing systems to actually address the disadvantage and the drivers of incarceration is what we need to focus on. So we know there's this evidence base, including a really strong evidence base about prisons' harms for disadvantaged populations and for First Nations communities. But what we've identified we're really lacking is resourcing for those sort of alternatives and also political will. So we're saying there's not just one magic reform fix, but rather that there's multiple reforms and changes that we could and should be working towards. And some of these reforms are around sentencing and law reform. For instance, here, there's a big debate at the moment about raising the age of criminal responsibility. There's debate about bail reform and activism around mandatory sentencing. There are things that work at the point of post-release that we know make a significant difference in terms of reducing incarceration. There are many reforms within correctional environments, which I'm sure many people on the call are more expert at than what I am. And there are some reforms that cut across many different parts of the justice, community and health sectors. We know that some options here involve expanding or scaling up really promising or services or programs that already have a significant evaluation or evidence base, and other options are much more about trying new approaches and systems. But we know that there is this need for multiple legislative and policy, social, health and human service reforms to be enacted so that historically really over-incarcerated and disadvantaged populations have the opportunity to thrive in the community. So in terms of the work that we're doing, there's a lot of talking and listening. We started in 2020, or sort of at the end of 2020. So we're kind of almost 2 years in to this work. We've been meeting with experts and stakeholders, including a lot of people with lived experience of incarceration, to really help map existing systems around Australia, develop this deep sense of what the drivers of incarceration are, and also keeping on really trying to make public and talk about what the evidence base around what works to reduce incarceration looks like. So there's a lot of public speaking and education, a lot of, as I said, systematic political advocacy, working with all sides of politics to increase the political appetite for resourcing alternatives to custody, and working towards evidence-based justice policy, both in corrections environments and in the community. And I should say, just on that, just on a really positive note, you know, we've found immense support privately in these political meetings with people often that in public are quite tough on crime, or, you know, that's been their political approach. There really is a strong sense around Australia that people are ready to do things differently, but are quite stuck in this kind of competition between the major political parties. So a lot of that political advocacy is really about acknowledging how difficult it is politically to move out of that habit, and really supporting those parliamentarians and ministers that do really, you know, are really trying to make a difference. So very publicly supporting people when they do embrace the kinds of reforms that we know are going to make a difference. We're doing a lot of media work, a lot of trying to raise the profile of this idea that jailing's failing, to do the things that the community sort of really expects it to do. And we're also working to really contribute to the evidence base and working to shift public policy by producing a whole range of materials. A lot of that is on our website, which is, I think, down the bottom there, and you can look it up online. But I guess just the final point, I think, given that we're sort of really talking about what kind of, you know, we're quite ambitious in our scope and really trying to imagine a different kind of system. And I'm often sort of thinking, when I worked in the community sector with many people coming out of prison, it was often really sort of, so many people described it as being a matter of luck if they happened to come across a service that was actually going to support them to make the kinds of changes that would enable them to break that cycle of incarceration. And that could be a program inside a prison, or it could be a program in a prison. It could be a connection with somebody, either a volunteer or it could be a family member. But there was nothing systematic about people's success stories. It was always a matter of luck. So I guess that what we're trying to do at the Justice Reform Initiative is to imagine a system where it's not just a matter of luck in terms of whether or not somebody can access support. So we're trying to imagine a community in which, for instance, every person who walked out of the prison gate and wanted some sort of support was actually able to access that. Or if every person who needed access to drug and alcohol support and treatment was able to access that at the point that they identified they needed it. Similarly, if every person who was homeless when they turned up at court, or homeless when they were in prison or released from custody, actually had somewhere safe to live. Similarly, for every First Nations person who was involved in the justice system, imagine if there was First Nations-led culturally meaningful support that both inside of prison and outside of prison that people could access. You get the picture. Same as for people with disabilities, if there was straightforward access to the supports that people needed. if every person who wanted opportunity or wanted the access to education or employment was actually able to do this. At the moment in Australia, we've got a lot of work to do to make that happen. But I guess what we're trying to do is say, look, this should not be a radical vision. This should be something actually that all of us in our community are aiming for, in order, because we know that with all of these things, all of us actually benefit in terms of safety, but also in terms of kind of becoming a sort of community that many of us actually really, aspire to. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now.